Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ralph Raymond. I'm the Assistant Director of Academic Programs for NYUAD Dhabi, based here in New York, supporting NYUAD Dhabi Institute at 19 Washington Square North. I have the great privilege of introducing today's speaker, Professor Masha Kirasirova. And before introducing Professor Kirasirova, I'm just going to mention a little bit about NYUAD Dhabi Institute at 19 Washington Square North. Since its inception in 2009, the NYUAD Institute in Abu Dhabi and in New York has provided a platform for exchange about the newest developments in research and scholarship across disciplines. The Institute in New York offers Washington Square community opportunities to hear experts talk about their research and their societal relevance, technology and cultural impact, and the importance for the world at large, ranging from artistic and creative innovations to issues of equity and inclusion, public health, environmental sustainability, among many others topics. As a hub for vibrant scholarly public engagement, the Institute is unparalleled in the Gulf region, and we are pleased to offer programming and extend the Institute's reach here at 19, the home of NYUAD Dhabi in New York, and pleased to extend that scholarly research through collaborations and work with our partners here on the Square. A little bit about Professor Kirasirova. Masha Kirasirova is an assistant professor of history at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and a graduate of the NYU New York Joint PhD program in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and History. Her work examines exchanges between Soviet Eurasia and the Middle East, bringing together several separate scholarly domains: Soviet nationalities, policy and empire, and social and cultural history of Stalinism and de-Stalinization, and intellectual history of the Arab left and the global Cold War. Her research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Program, and the International Research and Exchanges Board, as well as a number of other university-wide competitive research fellowships at NYU. She is co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Global 60s Between Protest and a Nation Building publication, and of Russian Arab Worlds, a documentary history published by Oxford University Press. Her recent monograph, The Eastern International Arabs, Central Asians, and Jews in the Soviet Union's Anti-Colonial Empire, was just awarded the 2024 AB Imperial Best Book Award. I should note is also now available at the NYU bookstore for purchase. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Masha Kirasirova.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for hosting me. And to all of you who came to listen to me on this beautiful spring day when, there are many more important things going on. So thank you. It's an honor to be able to present my book and to talk about this topic to you today. And it's especially nice to me. This is my home. These are my home departments, my advisors, my friends. So it's really wonderful to be able to share this with you. So today I'm going to talk about my recent book, which is The Eastern International, which is a study of cultural and political exchanges between Russia and the Middle East from the late imperial through the Putin era, with a focus on the Soviet period. And critical to these exchanges, I argue, was the Russian and later Soviet conception of the East. In fact, this concept was so important that right after overthrowing the provisional government in 1917, one of the first decrees issued by the Bolsheviks, alongside those for peace on all fronts of World War I and the abolition of private ownership of land, was the appeal to Muslims of Russia and the East to defend the revolution and its plenipotentiary government. So as an instrument of policy, the East was no mere abstraction. It was dynamic, and it could be mobilized by various mediators who were more or less legible as Eastern. Even Stalin occasionally played this card. In 1941, he told the Japanese foreign minister, Waikuse Matsuoka, during the negotiation of the non-aggression pact, "You are Eastern, and so am I. In this way, the distinction between domestic and foreign Easternness could overlap and produce possibilities for those who could claim this identity and deploy it creatively. The space of possibility is what I call the Eastern International. So it was a world of institutions that was built around Soviet assumptions of the East. And it was a world of people who navigated these institutions and used them to pursue various regional and global agendas. And I narrate the story through the experiences of people whose positionality made them default intermediaries, like Stalin, but many of the characters are Soviet Jews, Central Asians, and Arabs who moved across this divide between the domestic and foreign dimensions of this world, and in the process shaped it in profound and often unexpected ways. Their experiences illuminate new dimensions of Soviet and Middle Eastern history. They show what it took to build the Soviet anti-colonial empire and what it meant to protect its anti-colonial legitimacy, a paradoxical endeavor in which domestic differences were sometimes mobilized and sometimes erased to model decolonization abroad. Soviet citizens, Arab communists, leftists, and artists all participated and interacted to produce these effects and their erasures of difference. And more broadly, I contend that seeing these connections help explain the disciplinary gulf between studies of the Soviet Union and the wider socialist world on the one hand, and studies of the Middle East and other regions of the global South on the other. And through helping to explain this gulf, I'm hoping that this work will contribute to helping us overcome it and think about it differently. As a starting point, it might be useful to consider why, in his famous and influential book, Orientalism, Edward Said largely neglected Russia, and why his work was reciprocally neglected in Russian and Soviet studies before the 1990s. US modernization theory played a role in constructing the Cold War division of intellectual labor around distinct axes of communist, free, and traditional modern. And as a result, Soviet history was clustered along the first axis, whereas Said's critiques resonated much more along the second one, which included studies of the Middle East and South Asia and other regions of the global South. But like the Cold War itself, these politics of knowledge cannot be understood exclusively as a product of American power. Or rather, American power is not the only reason that the post-colonial lens was not applied to the Soviet Union for so long. The Soviet and Middle Eastern dimensions of the story are also important. And we can see them in the agency of these actors traveling across these spaces, in their ideas and their various interactions and exchanges. Now, historian Vera Tolz has already shown that one of the reasons Said's ideas did not come across as novel in Russia was because late imperial and early Soviet Orientalists anticipated many of his arguments about cultural imperialism and Eurocentrism, and as she suggests, influenced them directly. Vera Tolz traces Said's critiques through his citations of Arab Marxists, such as Anwar Abdelmalek, who borrowed them from the Soviet scholars like Sergei Oldenburg through his citations to the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. And my work takes this insight as a starting point for a larger exploration of 20th century linkages between the Soviet and Sovietized foreign-born Orientalists, bureaucrats working for various party-state organizations, making policy about the East, Soviet Central Asian politicians, artists, and various Marxists and leftists. Now, protecting anti-colonial legitimacy was a key objective of the Soviet Union's domestic and foreign policy, and it required consistent and systematic separation of Soviet history and culture from any critiques of colonialism and empire. This was done by controlling the narrative about the past in scholarship, in public diplomacy, and even in historical fictions and films. So in this regard, my book builds upon earlier intellectual histories of state censorship in academic and state politics, but with a larger archival base and a broader framework for considering state power. The effects of these erasures have been to delay our ability to draw comparisons between the Soviet Union and other empires, and to discourage scholars until recently, and this is really starting to change, I see with the new graduate work being done, from looking at these connections between the communist second world and anywhere in the developing world. and to protect the image of the Soviet Union as a disruptor of the Western-dominated international system and as standing on the side of the oppressed, which is something that Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been revitalizing on his many trips to Africa over the past 18 months. So to start to think about these dynamics differently, it is important to see these erasures and distortions as historical processes and their effects, and them as effects of Soviet and later Russian power. In my talk today, I'll give you some examples of how the Soviet Eastern vector of power linked various internal and external contexts and empowered different mediators. But the organization highlights another significant theme of the book, which is the politics of difference that were operative in the process of making and concealing the Soviet Empire. The categories that appear in the title, Arabs, Central Asians, and Jews, had very different ideological and political status vis-a-vis the anti-colonial state, and their status changed over time. These changes became visible thanks to my narrow regional sub-focus on the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically the parts of the Ottoman Empire that were subdivided after World War I into British and French mandatory entities of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, which was then further sub-partitioned. Occasionally, there are references to neighboring Egypt and Iraq, but this region then we know became one of the main theaters of the Cold War. And in the interwar period, its importance is less immediately apparent from any external Euro-American Cold War historical perspective. It comes into focus, however, in Bolshevik sources, when we see that early Bolshevik and Comintern officials saw it as an Achilles heel of French and British colonial empires because of its function as a link between European metropoles and more distant South Asia and East Asia. It was also significantly a solution to the Jewish question, which preoccupied the Bolshevik elites. The region was becoming an ever more popular destination for Russian Zionist migrants who were fleeing imperial legal restrictions on their geographical and social mobility, economic underdevelopment, and violent pogroms. These migrations produced a network of familial, social, and cultural connections between those Russian migrants who went to Palestine and some to Egypt, and members of the Bolshevik left who rejected this option and instead either joined one of the socialist parties in Russia and Ukraine. Eventually, most of them ended up joining the Social Democratic movement or one of the non-Bolshevik socialist Jewish parties, or eventually the apparatus of the party state. The book opens up with the story of one of these old Bolsheviks who hailed from the Kiev Governorate in the Pale of Settlement where Jews had lived since the reign of Catherine the Great. In his 1918 book, The East and Revolution, you can see here, Vostok и Революция, Konstantin Troinovsky coined the term the Eastern International, and he defined it as a revolutionary continuum stretching from Transcaucasia and Turkestan into Iran, India, and China. To him, this space or context was one in which Moscow could organize and lead a formidable anti-imperialist democratic front in opposition to the Western International of Capital. By 1921, when the Bolsheviks' hopes for revolution in Europe were waning and when they started to look more seriously towards Asia, Troinovsky was implementing his ideas as the founder of the Union for the Liberation of the East. And you can see his membership card decorated on the left. He was also the chief of the Near and Middle Eastern desk of the Comintern, the Third Communist International. And instead of books, he was now writing memos like this one on the activation of Eastern politics and building institutions. His department worked closely with the Comintern Turkestan Bureau, which was based in Tashkent, but sent agents into neighboring regions. And you can see here the diagram of this Turkestan Bureau, which appears in the cover. The red on the very top is Moscow, which is decentered, interestingly, in this schema. Then In yellow, there's Urumqi, Kashgar, and Andijan. In blue, Bukhara. Red is Khiva. The whole green section are various branches of the Iranian Communist Party and outposts of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then the orange triangles are Irkutsk, which is the Far East Bureau, and Baku. So structurally, this agency embodied Troianovsky's ideas about the role of geographical pivots of revolution. And aesthetically, it reflected the utopian spirit of the moment. You could see some of its forms and colors resemble the work of Kandinsky and other artists that also were collaborating and celebrating the revolution and working for the Comintern. Now, Troianovsky's later life remains mysterious. We know he was kicked out of the party and maintained a low profile, working as a researcher in economic geography for various state ministries, including Goswan, the State Planning Commission, responsible for coordinating and development of the economy and social services. And then later he subsisted on the income of his wife, who taught German dialect at a university that trained Soviet intelligence agents preparing to go to Europe. She was from Switzerland and a native speaker. But we know that before he left the party, in 1921, he was teaching at the Communist University for the Toilers of the East, a fascinating institution, which is the focus of my chapters 2 and 3. And besides Troianovsky, actually, so many of the early teachers in this university were Jewish that the Bolshevik Karl Radek famously joked that it was a place in which Polish and German Jews lectured in English to Chinese students about how to make Russian revolution. As an institution, KUTV was created in April 1921, before the Soviet Union, when its borders were still porous due to the ongoing civil war. And reflecting this porousness, its students drew from all over the former Ottoman Empire, Iran, East and Southeast Asia, South Africa, Inner Asia, and Khiva, Bukhara, and Turkestan, and the Caucasus, and it also included Black Americans. And its utopian mandate was challenged in the mid-1920s when the Bolsheviks announced socialism in one country in 1924 as a policy of strengthening socialism inside Soviet borders rather than working towards world revolution elsewhere. With this announcement, the expansive East came to encompass a contradictory terrain, which Stalin attempted to delineate in a speech at the university in 1925. When he defined the Soviet East, where imperialist oppression had been overthrown, and a foreign East, where imperialist oppression was still in full force. With this dichotomy, Stalin transformed the Eastern International into a relational space that both contained and represented a relationship between different sides of a new political border and also a revolutionary historical continuum. So there was an inside and an outside, but both parts remained vital to the mission of building anti-colonial empire. Both parts were significant to what the Bolsheviks called a laboratory for transforming Easterners from objects of history into its revolutionary subjects. Now, what did this liminality mean for the Eastern University? In the relatively tolerant ideological atmosphere of the 1920s, which is the subject of chapter 2, the university functioned like a kind of portal, which allowed two-way traffic between efforts to build socialism in one country and spreading revolutionary ideas around the world. You can see this. These are students from the Arabic section, pictured in front of the Institute for Oriental Studies. The guy with the beard in the middle is Krachkovsky, a famous Arabist and scholar of Arabic literature. And you can see some of the students from this university who, according to one of the alumnus, Najati Sidqi, he described this group as consisting of 52 students, 10 Egyptians, 15 Palestinian Arabs, 5 Palestinian Jews, 7 Syrians, 10 Lebanese, 3 Algerians, and 2 Moroccans. And archival sources give similar breakdowns and numbers. So for example, there were a few dozen Arab sector students out of a total of 567 foreign ones, mostly from East Asia, Outer Mongolia, and Iran. But then unexpectedly in the 1920s, this era turned out to be a decade of political and ideological border making. In the Eastern Mediterranean, colonial governments experimented with drawing and redrawing borders and creating new proto-states. Within these polities, a plethora of nationalist movements emerged in Egypt and Syria and Palestine, which included a more ambiguous pan-Arab nationalism that grew out of late Ottoman cultural Arabism. Some students, like Hamdi Salam from Egypt, were able to, in this period, naturalize and become Soviet citizens, professionals, and part-time Orientalists. Hamdi actually taught Arabic to a later generation of Moscow Arabists. He worked on a dictionary of colloquial Egyptian dialect and was described in his obituary as a Russian Arab. And the term they used was Российский Arab, so using instead of Ruski, highlighting his belonging to the Russifying central state rather than to a Russian ethnic or linguistic community. In the late 1920s, and even more so in the 1930s, which is the focus of my chapter 3, relations between teachers and students grew increasingly tense. This was because of rapid changes in Soviet domestic politics, with the transition from a more flexible economy under the new economic policy to the more rigid first five-year plan, which brought general scarcity of goods and food, and also because of changes in the Comintern's approach to colonized and decolonizing regions, which created openings for newer cadres to purge more established ones. Now, these purges were happening all over the Soviet Union, but in the Comintern, they ended up taking up and being politicized in a particular way after 1927, when Stalin had drastically miscalculated his revolutionary alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, who betrayed Stalin by massacring hundreds of communists and labor activists in Shanghai. Following this incident, the Comintern revisited its earlier strategy of engagement with the East. Instead of trying to form alliances with revolutionary intellectuals, pacifists, or bourgeois anti-colonial nationalists, it emphasized recruitment of people from working class or peasant backgrounds. For communist parties of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, this shift then had particular ethnic implications. In 1928, the Comintern issued a directive to Arabize these communist parties, by which they meant accepting and promoting more ethnic Arabs, which were the native majority that constituted the proletarian and peasant class, to positions of authority. Since their formation in the 1920s, these parties were all dominated by ethnic minorities, mostly Armenians, Jews, Kurds, who had been alienated from other majoritarian nationalist movements in the region. The new directive to Arabize recast earlier communist leaders as advocates for minority rights. And this directive was especially consequential for the Palestine Communist Party, where, except for Sidqi, the majority of the leadership remained Jewish. And the party was asked to Arabize just as tensions in Palestine were mounting, with successive waves of Zionist migration, expanding Zionist landholdings, and growing economic disparities. The party was still debating how to Arabize when violent protests erupted in Jerusalem in August 1929 over Jewish breaches of a 1911 status quo agreement concerning rituals at the Wailing Wall. The protests then spread to Hebron, Jaffa, and Safed, killing 133 Jews and 116 Arabs in 1 week. The violence shocked the Palestine Communist Party leaders, reminding many of them of pogroms that they had fled in Russia. The Comintern leadership in Moscow, by contrast, interpreted this violence very differently and through the lens of the domestic East. At this time, the Comintern Eastern Section leader was an old Bolshevik named Grigory Safarov, who had observed during the civil war in Central Asia tensions between Muslim and Russian colonial settlers empowered by the imperial regime, and argued that these dynamics must be corrected to ensure that socialist construction would not inadvertently replicate decades of Russian national privilege and colonial bias, this kolonizatorski uklon. And as a result, Slavic settlers and Cossack peasants were forcibly removed, even though they had overwhelmingly aided the Red Army in the Civil War. This mass expulsion resulted in a decline in Kazakhstan's Russian population by almost 20% before it was officially halted and determined in 1922 to have been carried out with excessive cruelty and the character of revenge. The situation in Palestine seemed to Safarov to be analogous, and the Comintern's Executive Committee issued a resolution that characterized the 1929 violence as an Arab uprising against British imperialism and Zionism, and not a pogrom. The Comintern also condemned any Palestine Communist Party slogans that promoted brotherhood between Jews and Arabs as aiding imperialism. So here we have an example of how the domestic East was used to think about politics in the foreign East. But the story does not end there. Returnees from Palestine who were teaching at Qutb continued to debate the significance of the 1929 violence on the pages of Pravda and Comintern publications. Their disagreements revolved around things like the revolutionary potential of the Arab national bourgeoisie, whether it was compromised by its links to foreign capital. They debated the usefulness of the Asiatic mode of production for thinking about Oriental societies, and whether or not the Ottoman Empire could be considered an imperialist power. But in the process, the polemicists drew attention to the fact that they had spent time in Palestine and in different ways had empathized with Jewish victims of the 1929 violence. Such public disagreements in the context of intensifying Stalinist purges created openings. In Qutb, it sparked a wave of denunciations that started with the Palestinian student Subbotin, who was born in Jaffa in 1903 and came to Qutb in 1927, who submitted a report to the Qutb leadership calling the Palestine Communist Party General Secretary an opportunist, and accused him of fanning tensions among Palestinian workers. Subbotin further demanded that the Qutb Arab Circle leader, who was a Jew, named Avigdor, was replaced by a Russian representative of the All-Union Communist Party. Now, the Comintern's International Control Commission, which was the highest court that adjudicated disputes between international communists, concluded that Subbotin should be reprimanded for promoting factionalism within the party and be expelled from Qutb. Considered too dangerous to be sent back to Palestine, he eventually found employment at the Moscow Institute for Oriental Studies. And other denunciations against Avigdor and other Jewish Qutb instructors all resulted in this period with Arab students being expelled and some even being exiled to Central Asia. This pattern continued until the mid-1930s, when the assassination of the Leningrad party boss Sergei Kirov in early December 1934, and also an accusation by the future state security chief, Nikolai Yezhov, that Trotsky, Kamenev, and the former Comintern leader Zinoviev had direct involvement in this murder, set off a wave of purges in the Comintern and at this university. As a result of these purges, key figures were removed, and new ambitious mediators, like the Kurdish communist from Syria, Khalid Bagdash, were able to leverage accusations against Avigdor, to promote himself. In 1936, Avigdor was finally purged from the Communist Party and sent to a labor camp where he died. He was then posthumously rehabilitated in 1956, but as you can see here, Bagdash ended up leading the Syrian Communist Party into the mid-90s. So this story illustrates a whole host of entanglements between the domestic and foreign Easts. But the most important ones here are that Comintern officials applied lessons from the domestic East, and specifically from Turkestan, related to nationalities policies and colonialism, to their thinking about the Foreign East. And we even see this, by the way, in Avigdor's, this is his work history, from his personal file, and we see there between that's his work history between assignments in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. There's an assignment in Turkestan, and then he goes back to the Middle East. So you see, people moving between these spaces. This story also illustrates that events outside Soviet borders, in China, in Palestine, and elsewhere, reverberated through the academic culture of Qutb and the Comintern more broadly, and intersected with other internal and external transformations. Thus, one of the effects of the growing tensions in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s was that the majority of high-level Jewish mediators of this world, many of whom had some connection to Palestine, were purged in the second half of the 1930s. And then these purges created openings for new mediators in the Eastern International that were of Armenian, Tatar, Arab background. And ultimately, this is a story of empire and of an abiding politics of difference in the making of an anti-colonial modernizing state with interconnected internal and external components. On the one hand, a situation beyond Soviet borders could reconfigure relationships between groups of people and give their differences new meaning. On the other hand, Soviet domestic processes like the purges or even affirmative action could be used to consolidate power outside of Soviet borders. Finally, Soviet power and such exchanges between domestic and foreign Easts shaped the experiences of many people, actually not even only communists. So in this period, especially in the 1940s, which is a period that people who study Soviet-Arab relations largely ignored because Stalin was largely uninterested in the Middle East and was focused mostly on security in Asia and Europe. And also because the purges so damaged these internationally oriented institutions. Qutb closed down in 1938, the Comintern closed down in 1943, and even the diplomatic corps was really cobbled by the purges, and there was lots of understaffing and censorship. But nevertheless, we see this formula of the domestic East being used as a model for the foreign East. And it was taken up by various allies, including anti-fascist supporters of the Soviet war effort and other sympathetic fellow travelers and leftists. And in chapter 4 of the book, I follow a group of Syrian and Lebanese intellectuals who were active in various anti-fascist causes in the 1930s, whom Soviet cultural diplomacy organizations rewarded with a tour of the Soviet Union in 1947. And the way that they wrote about this tour, with silences about late Stalin-era censorship, which they reproduced. And I ended up following these people. I was so interested in them. I followed them later into the 1950s, where they reconfigured themselves into regional branches of the Partisans of the Peace, and actually sought out alliances with various religious and right-wing allies that would have never worked with communists. They also translated Soviet literary and scientific texts and used them to think about nationalism, cultural decolonization, and the challenges of building a more just and peaceful world. But in the monograph, I focus more on other mediators whom the ideological domestic foreign axis helped catapult to power. The most prominent of these figures was Nureddin Muhyiddinov, an Uzbek politician who became the highest ranking Central Asian in the Soviet government. In 1957, he became a full member of the Politburo, which is the highest ranking policy authority within the Soviet Union, and a candidate member of the Presidium of the Union-wide Communist Party. In 1958, he joined the party's secretariat. So in fact, during a 1959 visit to the USSR, the US statesman Averell Harriman reported that Khrushchev spoke of Muhyiddinov as one of his possible successors for top job of General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And yet Muhyiddinov was an ethnic Uzbek from just outside Tashkent who studied Arabic as part of his early childhood education. and ended up joining the Communist Youth Organization and was then sent by it to Moscow to study in a trade cooperative institute, which many people I've interviewed suggested was actually a KGB preparatory school, but there's no proof of that. To understand how Mukhydinov was able to rise so high so quickly, it helps to consider the reorientation of Soviet politics after Stalin's death in the new context of decolonization and Cold War competition. In the United States, this competition also contributed to the reckoning with some of the contradictions between the ideology of democracy, which the United States projected domestically and internationally, and its racial politics. These contradictions ended up shaping the more pro-civil rights posture adopted by the Truman and Eisenhower administrations as part of the US's international agenda to contain communism. Historians of US foreign policy and cultural relations like Penny von Eschen and Richard Candida Smith have illustrated how the expansion of American cultural programs into Asia, Africa, and Latin America added impetus to the American civil rights movement and highlighted the voices of Latin American intellectuals and artists. In the Soviet case, pressures of international competition also drew attention to domestic inequality. Similarly, by exploiting the underdeveloped domestic East as evidence of Soviet colonial oppressions of Muslims, Western journalists, academics, and politicians, and later in the 60s, Chinese ones, helped create opportunities for Central Asians. Nuruddin Mukhydinov was able to navigate this nexus of Soviet international ambition, of international pressure, and the domestic affirmative action brilliantly, achieving this high level of power that was previously unattainable by any Soviet Central Asian, or for that matter, any marginalized minority representing an ethnically diverse Cold War superpower. Certainly no African-American cultural or political ambassador from the United States or Muslim from China was able to rise that high in the power structure. In general, the Soviet community of experts on the East was much more heterogeneous and inclusive of various ethnicized minorities than similar communities of experts in Europe and the US. And this was not despite Soviet state Orientalism, but because of it. Indeed, studying Orientalism was an incredibly prestigious and venture and often led to rapid social mobility, especially for people from the domestic East. And many of the people I've interviewed really looked at Mukhydinov as a pioneer of this, of harnessing the social and symbolic power of the East and using it to bolster his influence and reach. He did this in part, and we could see him here with Khrushchev. He did this in part by being a good drinking buddy, which was a prerequisite for any high-level political job in the Soviet Union. He was also always ready to help Khrushchev navigate two conflicting imperatives of foreign policy, of perpetual peace in the face of new atomic threats and commitments to anti-colonial causes, while also making unsettling decisions about the fates of Arab communists who were being actively and brutally repressed by Nasser and other leaders of decolonizing regimes, and the job of whitewashing and these compromises with cultural diplomacy, with amicable exchanges of cultural delegations, tourism, stipends for study at Soviet universities, and other activities fell to Mukhydinov. Khrushchev trusted Mukhydinov to navigate this problem, and because he saw him as an expert in Eastern politics because of Mukhydinov's Easternness, Khrushchev regularly referred to Mukhydinov as a representative of the East, as a son of a Muslim, and as someone who could control, embody, and deploy these identities to help the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's Orientalism led him to assume that one Easterner could better understand another, so he sent Mukhydinov to guide foreign leaders around the USSR. And Mukhydinov, in turn, would use these connections to raise his own profile and channel resources to his allies in Uzbekistan. For instance, after accompanying Nehru on a tour of Uzbek cities in 1955, he stressed Nehru's remarks that more attention needed to be paid to the historical ties between India, Uzbekistan, and other Central Asian republics. And he made similar comments after spending time with Nasser in the Soviet Union. An even more politically sensitive power that Khrushchev delegated to Muhyiddinov, however, was to fix problems of Soviet nationalities politics. This was the domestic counterpart to thinking about Eastern affairs abroad. So Muhyiddinov, for example, led the efforts to de-Stalinize Uzbekistan by announcing the rehabilitation of a number of high-profile victims of Stalin-era repressions. And he was also responsible for managing nationalist uprisings in the Baltics and elsewhere. And these processes were all incredibly messy and earned Muhyiddinov many enemies, such that by 1961, he lost both his seat in the Presidium and his post in the Secretariat. So he was basically out of power. Decades later, after independence of Uzbekistan, he described this demotion as the result of a disagreement about nationalities policies with Suslov and other apologists of great power chauvinism. But the reality was much more complicated, and there were many theories about why he was ultimately demoted. What is important for the story, however, was that he was able to rebound. After the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when the Soviet Union was changing its ambassadors in Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, Muhyiddinov was appointed ambassador to Damascus, where he served until 1977. In this post, he helped manage Soviet aid and cultural exchanges during the construction of the Euphrates High Dam, and essentially built the architecture of the Soviet and later Russian alliance with Syria. This relationship is something I'm focusing on more now, looking at exchanges in science and technology and culture, and these relationships around Soviet development aid and what they can tell us about the Soviet domestic empire and the boundaries between different kinds of belonging and non-belonging. The concluding case study of this monograph focuses on the story of a filmmaker that illuminates another set of connections between the two Easts made possible by Soviet state Orientalism. The realization that film could reach greater audiences in the non-Western world than literature led Soviet cultural bureaucracies to invest heavily in Afro-Asian cinematic networks. Yet telling stories about how the Soviet Union was decolonized proved more difficult for most domestic Easterners than simply presenting non-white faces of the Soviet Union or reflecting on shared Muslim cultural backgrounds. The person that was tasked with creating a narrative about how the Bolshevik Revolution unfolded in the Soviet East that would ideally appeal to domestic and foreign audiences was a Tajik-born but Uzbek-assimilated film director, Kamil Yarmatov. But with all of his power and prestige, Yarmatov still struggled with the ideological constraints on historical interpretation of Central Asia's past. These constraints had become so extensive that the most talented and creative minds in Soviet screenwriting could not produce something that anyone could acknowledge to be good work. At the 1968 Afro-Asian Film Festival, which Yarmatov hosted, he still had to perform for foreign audiences the role of a successful Soviet Easterner liberated by the revolution. But his films about how the domestic East could be a model for the foreign East completely flopped. Soviet and international filmmakers, as well as the more disaffected generation of Soviet youth, had moved on to more playful and subversive treatments of the Sovietization of Central Asia, like White Son of the Desert, which made fun of it in various ways. As the narrative threads connecting the two Easts unraveled, Soviet institutions continued to facilitate more emotive and less historically grounded linkages between these regions. In the early 19th, and as you can see here in these photographs from the film festival, in the early 1970s, despite brutal repression of communists in Ba'ath Syria and Iraq, the Soviet Komsomol, for example, still invited Syrian and Iraqi Ba'athist youth to celebrate Arab-Soviet friendship in Tashkent and Dushanbe against the same backdrop that was used for decades to host their communist victims. These linkages, as well as the general expansion of Soviet commitments in Asia and Africa, were fueled by the proceeds of the 1973 oil revolution, the late then 1980s collapse of the Soviet economy and institutions correlated with the explicit reversal of multiple assumptions underlying the Eastern International. Signs of institutional and material disintegration included the questioning of Soviet economic and cultural development models by Central Asian and other Soviet intellectuals, the rebranding of the domestic East as a drain on Russian resources, and growing racism and resentment of domestic Eastern migrants in Moscow and St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, and also requests from Soviet diplomats for bailouts from Gulf monarchies. So what? I guess what I would like you to take away from this talk is that these transferences between the Soviet domestic and foreign or international Eastern spheres have significance that is both political and epistemic. The political dimensions are clear. We live in a world that is produced in part by Soviet anti-colonialism. I've met many people across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia who still look to Russia and to Putin because of the legacies of Soviet engagement with anti-colonial causes, including its anti-Western messages. People are still sending their kids to study in Russia because they studied in the USSR. They consume Russian TV and its messages about opposing Western globalization, and to a large extent accept its narratives about what happens in Russia, both domestically and in its war in Ukraine and struggle against Western domination. Russia's domestic East, which is much smaller than the Soviet Union's domestic East, is still politically useful and controlled by intermediaries like Ramzan Kadyrov and his family. Uzbekistan is still positioning itself to become the next political and economic leader of the Central Asian region. The epistemic dimensions are less obvious. The problem lies in the historical boundaries of the Soviet field and its sequestration from other areas of knowledge. A key function of all of these intermediaries I study was to conceal all the imperial and especially colonial dimensions of the Soviet state, domestically and internationally, and to make it difficult to think about it comparatively or even see connectivity beyond the simplistic frameworks of communist and anti-communist propaganda. Inside the USSR, people were obviously discouraged from reflecting on inequalities between regions, nations, and especially races publicly, at least before Perestroika. And even stories like Mukhyidinov's were suppressed. In fact, his memoir was banned in Uzbekistan in the 1990s when President Karimov was trying to distance the country from its Soviet past. Beyond Soviet borders, these politics have also produced silences about the Soviet Union, its history, and its politics with important consequences. Arab visitors to the USSR, communists and leftists, were more invested in the Soviet Union as an idea than they were in it as a reality. So they wrote about the state, its society, and culture in ways that were largely ahistorical. They read Russian and Soviet literature, they argued about socialist realism, they were inspired by Soviet aesthetics and theories, and used Marxist-Leninist ideas to think about nationalism, economic development, and global inequality. But they found it difficult to use these ideas to think about historical contingency or to see them as connected to a Soviet historical context. And I think in somewhat even analogous ways in scholarship of the Middle East and South Asia, even in the United States, people still occasionally refer to Lenin and other Soviet writings and use them as analytical tools while stressing their separateness from their historical context and the context of the translation, publication, and circulation of these texts. Seeing these exchanges historically, I argue, illuminates new dimensions of the Soviet Empire and its politics of difference in the way that it organized space, people, and ideas. but it also illuminates blind spots about it in other fields and helps us overcome these epistemic distortions. Now, and a key dimension of this Eastern politics of difference and its effectiveness was its longevity. The persistent institutionalized projections of a domestic East as a model for the foreign East brought endless streams of foreigners to witness development in the Soviet East, streams of Soviet experts to aid in the development of the foreign East. And besides people, it also facilitated the circulation of objects like publications, ideas of anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, and anti-racism in ways that do not easily fit into models of integration that we have to work with from global history, which usually rely on economic circuits of exchange. And so these forces make us, we are forced, I guess, to consider the push and pull beyond market economy and to expand our notions of the global to consider alternative models of integration and globalization. Thank you very much.